Good morning Year 9, it's Mrs Woolard here again, and today we are looking at your home learning task 4. So far you have covered now all 4 aspects of the Anglo-Saxons in terms of crimes, punishments, law enforcement, and the last thing that you did this week, you were looking at trials. So let's have a little bit more of a look at the trials you were looking at. So you were looking at trial by ordeal, which is a trial, not a punishment, and it's a way of establishing guilt or innocence by letting God decide. So if we go into a little bit more detail, this is a description of what trial by ordeal is. So first of all, it's a trial. It's a way of establishing, are you guilty or innocent? Again, I have to say it is not a punishment, even though it looks like one. And of course, this kind of trial doesn't have a judge or a jury. The point of this trial is that God decides whether you are guilty or innocent. So God is acting as the judge. So how does trial by ordeal actually work? So first of all the ordeals happen in a church apart from the cold water one. First of all, the accused person has to fast, so that's not eat, for 3 days, and then they would hear mass in preparation for the trial. A priest would always be present at the trial because of the fact that it would be God that would judge whether you were guilty or innocent. So let's have a look at the different kinds of trial that you could go through as an Anglo-Saxon. So first of all here we have the trial by hot iron, and this one is usually taken by women, and they had to pick up a red hot object and walk for 3 paces with that object. Then the hand would be bandaged up, and 3 days later that hand would then be unbandaged, and they would have a look to see whether it was starting to heal, in which case they were innocent, or whether it was like full of gunk and pus and disgusting things, in which case God had decided they were guilty. Now the equivalent of that for men was a trial by hot water, which was exactly the same principle. So what they'd have to do is to put their hand into a pot of boiling water to collect an object and pull that object out of the water. Then the same thing applied. The hand would be bandaged up for 3 days, and when the 3 days were over, they would then look at that hand and see whether or not it was healing or not. And again, if it was healing, then they were innocent. If it wasn't, they were guilty. Now there's 2 more kinds of trial by ordeal. There's trial by blessed bread. So a priest would bless a piece of bread and ask God to make the accused choke on that bread if they were guilty. So all they had to do was to eat a piece of bread, but if they choked while they were eating it, then they were seen as guilty in God's eyes. Now finally, trial by cold water was outside a church, and this would be usually men, and they would be dropped into water on the end of a rope, and if they floated at that point, which let's face it, you probably would, you were then guilty because God's pure water had decided to reject you because you were guilty. But if you sank, the pure water had accepted you, and therefore you were innocent. But of course, you were probably also dead. So, you now know everything you need to know on Anglo-Saxons for the Crime and Punishment course. But before we move on to the second piece of this course, the Normans, I want to check what you know and what you understand. So this week's work, you will be taking quizzes and tests and answering questions on the work that we've already done so far to check you understand before we move on to the Normans. So enjoy, I'll see you next week.